Here we are again at McKillop House. Thank you for coming, and the people online, welcome. Let us first acknowledge the traditional custodian of this land and pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. This evening, we're delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Rod. So lovely to have you here, who you will remember spoke to us last August on 10 Jungian journeys on a fragile planet. Tonight, Rod will be speaking about something that should be of great interest to all of us, the path to a sustainable civilization. With the arrival of catastrophic storms, fires and droughts in recent years, it's becoming apparent that we have now entered a climate crisis, but it should come as no surprise because the science has been telling us for decades this would happen. Rod Taylor is a science writer, broadcaster, newspaper columnist, and author. He has written for numerous publications, including for The Big Issue, Fairfax Media, Australian Community Media, and various magazines. Rod produces a weekly science program and podcast for Radio 2XX. His weekly science column is in its 13th year and has written and edited a number of books.
Okay.
So we'll have Rod's presentation, and then halfway through, about 9:15, then or around 9ish, whatever, see how you go. We'll have a break, have a supper, and then we'll come back for questions. So if you're here on Zoom, please remain muted while Rod is speaking. Use Zoom chat for comments, and we'll open up later for discussion. Thank you, Rod. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you for coming along today, and thank you to the people on Zoom. I can't see you, but I know you're out there somewhere. So these are the books that Jean was referring to, and so that's the most recent book, The Path to a Sustainable Civilization, and then this is the book that I was talking about last time I was here, 10 Journeys on a Fragile Planet. So this is the story of 10 environmentalists, and it's really character studies. And I wanted to know what makes these people tick, what drives them, and what gives them the energy to do the sorts of things they do to work on and save the environment. This one is more bringing together a package of all the things that we need to drive our civilization towards sustainability, and that'll be the focus of my talk today. And just quickly, we've got a friend in the audience here, Suzanne Ferris, and this is her book, which I read recently, and she's got one for sale. One lucky person can get this from Suzanne, and it's Let's Not Lose Them, Endangered Species. And Suzanne clearly has a great love of nature, and she tells wonderful stories about different sorts of animals and so on, insects, even spiders. She loves spiders because they're part of it. And I was going to say to you, Suzanne, we need a chapter on fungus. Fungus, nobody loves fungus, but they're necessary in the ecology. And parasites even. Parasites, yes, parasites. Anyway, I brought a little something to show you. And in fact, you're probably wondering, what's Rod doing with a bit of stick here? Well, guess what? This came from just outside the door there. And I noticed it when I was here for your Christmas party this year. And it's called box elder, I believe. And this stuff is appearing everywhere. It's actually a maple species, and it's from North America, and it's prolific. It's growing everywhere. So that I could have brought in any number of invasive species, but the reason I've done this is because it's an example of something in the Anthropocene. We have such a profound influence on the planet that we have tipped the Earth into an entirely new geological epoch called the Anthropocene. And one of the markers will be things like this. Now, Suzanne's book is really very much about extinctions, but less well known is the fact that we humans are responsible for the great dispersal, because we pick up this stuff and we've carted it around the world. And now we've got the European bees and varroa mite, fire ants, African love grass, gamba grass, you name it, we've brought this around. And this stuff has a really enormous impact on the environment. And I'm sorry, but once you start to see weeds and so on, you can't unsee them. So when I ride my bicycle around, I see African love grass. I've just got back from Darwin, and in Darwin, you could see gamba grass right across the countryside. And it's called a transformational weed because it has such an enormous impact on the environment that it actually transforms the landscape. Now, sometimes I think, I do this little thought exercise, what would a future archaeologist make of our time today if they were looking back on this period of history? What would they see? Well, it'd be glass, radioactive isotopes, steel, all the bits in this room, concrete, you name it. There'd be this really distinctive geological layer, atmospheric and oceanic carbon, which we've now released into the atmosphere, into the environment from the reserves in the ground. And then I think, there won't be a future archaeologist because there won't be a future civilization. We have already harvested the easy resources, the coal, the gas, the oil, the energy in particular. Those energy resources are largely gone. The easy materials, the minerals and so on, they're gone. We've got climate change and other resources that we would be using. That's gone. And they're all the things you need to power a global civilization like the one that we have right now. Now, when I use the word civilization, you could say that's a debatable label, but I'm really talking about the human enterprise, which is now global. Gone are the times when our impact was local because the world is so deeply interconnected. And it's an amazing thing about our society, our civilization, that stuff comes to us as if by magic. And I was sitting in the hotel having my breakfast in Darwin, a very nice hotel, and how could you not like a nice hotel? But there's something really, really quite, I don't know, it just didn't gel. And it occurred to me that it's an enormous conjuring trick. I was sitting there eating eggs and the fresh fruit and so on. All this stuff came from this table inside the dining room. And around us were all the staff fussing, just trying to make everything perfect. But I don't have a real sense of how it was getting to my table. Where did this stuff come from? Like at one level, I know that it came from a shop and from a farm, but is it grown sustainably? Are the labour conditions reasonable from where the stuff was grown? I don't know. I can guess, but I really don't know. And if I went to an Indigenous person anywhere around the world of pre-colonialism, and I said to them, that spear, that basket, that bowl, where did that come from? And they would say, well, I got it from that tree over there, or she made it from that, and so on. They had a very intimate connection. Where did your dinner come from? I just dug it up. I just caught it. But that food arriving on my plate in the Darwin Hotel was where? I don't know. And now take an even more complicated object like my mobile phone. This thing is extremely complicated. There are 20 or 30 different metals used in making this phone. It's all embodied in there. There's plastics, there's the high-grade silicon, and so on and so on. And I was reading a book called The Rare Metals War, and it was talking about the mining of minerals in Central Africa and in China. And this stuff is done in appalling environmental conditions. They destroy the river, they destroy the soil, they poison themselves, but yet it just appeared, from my point of view, it appeared in a box in the shop, and then now it's mine. Now, in a couple of years' time, the battery's going to die in this. What am I going to do with it? Well, I'll try to do the right thing. I'm going to put it in the recycling place, and I'm going to hope like crazy that the thing will get used, that the materials will get extracted from that. It's not trivial trying to extract things from this. And in fact, for my column in the paper, I'm going to chase down what it means to extract minerals, metals. It's called demineralize, because this stuff's all deeply bound up and you need a lot of energy to get it back again. Now, one of the best examples of recycling is the aluminium. And I think it's around 60, 70%, something like that. And it has to have about 10% virgin metal going into it every time because of impurities building up. So this leads me into a bunch of myths about sustainability. And I'm going to really quickly fly through these, and then I'm going to dig into them in a little bit more detail. And the first myth is that we've got time. That, oh, well, we can we'll get there eventually. Well, I don't know if you've been looking at the news lately, but they're talking about the ice sheets in the Antarctic becoming destabilised. There's uncertainty about what's going to happen to the Atlantic Gulf Stream. It brings warm water up to Western Europe. If that thing fails, then I hate to think what's going to happen to Europe. And there's any number of terrible things going on in the environment. The sixth mass extinction right now, that's underway. We don't have time. And in fact, it's got so serious that the best we can hope for is a soft landing. And I talk to a lot of people in the sustainability environment science area, and the feeling is pretty much universal. That's where we are right now. The next myth is about growth, that we've got to keep growing the economy. We get trickle-down economics, that everybody will be better off because we'll just grow and grow. Well, I'm going to come back and talk in a little bit more detail about that, but that's definitely a myth. There's the technology myth, that we just have a bit of carbon capture and storage, or electric vehicles, a few solar panels, wind turbines. Well, very much in favour of renewable energy, and Mark and I are very strong on that. But it's also a myth, and I'm going to come back and explain in a moment why we say that's a myth. Then there's the cluster of three related topics. There's the environment and natural resources, there's society, and there's the economy. And you might have heard the phrase, the triple bottom line. That brings all of these three things together. And we live in an economy that views the environment and society as an externality. It's something outside the economy. And there's a branch of economics called environmental economics, and it pretty much ignores the fact that the environment is a limited resource. Have you ever been to one of the iron ore mines or a mine site? We went to Mount Tom Price in Western Australia, and it's quite amazing. Everything is really, really big. And there's almost nobody working there, which is pretty amazing. Almost nobody. That thing's automated to the nth degree. But when you stand and look at the mine site, it used to be a mountain about 100 metres tall. Now it's a hole about 100 and something metres deep and really wide, several kilometres wide. So that represents a resource that is now spent. That's gone. You cannot re-spend that money. And E.F. Schumacher wrote his famous book, Small is Beautiful. And the way he put it is, we are spending capital, we're spending an asset as if it were income. So if I went to my financial advisor and I said, hey, my strategy now is going to be to take everything I've got and sell it and spend it as fast as I can, I'd go, you're a complete nut. Well, but that's what we're doing in our economy. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the circular economy, about why that idea is flawed. Now, there's a very intimate relationship between society, the environment, and the economy. And what I've been describing is an economy that puts the economy at the pinnacle, right? Everything else is secondary to it. But without a healthy environment, you don't have a healthy economy. And without a healthy society, you don't have a healthy economy. I'll take an example of that. Margaret Thatcher's Britain. Margaret Thatcher famously said, there is no such thing as society. That's like a really absurd thing to say. That's just completely crazy. I don't think Margaret Thatcher really thought there was no such thing as society. I think what Margaret Thatcher was saying is society is not important. That's what she really meant. And even a progressive presidential US candidate, Bill Clinton, guess what his campaign slogan was? It's the economy, stupid. Now look what happened in Margaret Thatcher's Britain, early 1980s. In Brixton in particular, there was a disadvantaged community, immigrant community, lots of unemployment. The police were targeting people from different ethnic groups. And there was a little incident that just triggered the whole thing because the tension was building up and building up until this moment. And you know what the people said? We've had enough. And there was rioting. They set shops on fire, they turned cars upside down, and they did about £100 million worth of damage, immediate damage to costs, right? And that's not even counting all the knock-on costs. Imagine what that did to the business. Imagine what that did to the local economy, let alone what it did to the people who were living there. So Margaret Thatcher, how did that work for you? You're telling me you don't care about society and because it's the economy, stupid? Well, we cannot afford to forget social equality. And look what's happening in the United States. We have that awful man who used to be president, thinks he wants to come back again. And why is America like that? Why are they doing that? Well, it's a complicated question and I'm not going to come close to answering, but I can tell you one part of it. And someone was relating a story to me recently and they said there was a woman, she had a health issue. She needed immediate attention. She went to a private hospital and medical care in the US is really expensive. It's way out of reach of so many people. And they went, oh, no, you can't come here. They shipped her to a public hospital. And the public hospital said, oh, no, you haven't got health insurance, whatever. No, sorry. They stuck her in a wheelchair. She's having a health emergency and they wheeled her out onto the street. Now, you'd be pretty unhappy if that's what happened to you or it happened to someone you know, someone you care about. So why are Americans unhappy? That's a pretty good clue. Do we care about the economy? We bloody well should. And related to this is the notion that the market will fix it. Yeah, the market will take care of it. Well, there are so many examples of where that fails, but no one likes bureaucracy. No one likes excessive government. I certainly don't, and we've all seen plenty of that. But the problems facing our civilization, problems facing humanity now are of such a scale that individual uncoordinated action will fail. But let me give you a trivial example of that. And I was driving, I don't drive very much, I'm pleased to say, but coming along Parks Way during peak hour recently, 3 lanes of traffic, and then you always get someone diving in between and out the lanes, right? Well, do you know what happens when people do that? It actually makes everybody slower. If everybody just stayed in their lane and kept a reasonable buffer to the car in front, the whole flow would be much improved. But when everybody chasing individual self-benefit, then everything is worse off. So we've got to have some constraints on individual freedom. And I don't like being constrained, none of us do, but our civilisation is incredibly complex now, and we have no choice but to do that kind of thing. Now, the next myth is that the government can't afford it. Right, it all costs too much money, that we can't afford to pay people decent pension, decent healthcare, education, and so on and so on. It all costs money. Well, this is a really big myth, and that is that the federal government has a limited money supply, but a federal government is not like a household. A federal government, and it's a bit more complicated than I'm putting it, it's quite a deep topic, but a federal government like our Australian government can effectively create its own money. It just comes out of thin air. And I was interviewing Professor Stephen Hale, he's an economist, and this thing called modern monetary theory, and he was telling me that during the pandemic, he said, and I forget the numbers exactly, that the government pumped all this money into the economy. And he said to me, I always remember how he put it, he said there wasn't that much money in the entire economy. They could not borrow that money from private industry, the cash simply didn't exist. So they created it on a keyboard, and there it was, it magically appeared. Now, what does that mean? Or apart from the fact that we can be a lot more relaxed about government spending, it means that we don't have to worry about deficit. And the other thing that Stephen Howell told me was that you see governments always talking about budget repair. You know, we've got to get the government, the budget back into surplus. And he said the only significant period in Australian history where we've ever been in surplus was during the Howard Costello years. And what that did was it sucked money out of the economy, in effect, and it drove the private sector into debt. That's the effect of it. So, now there are constraints on spending, and that's inflation, and it's a bit more complicated, but the short answer is, as long as they don't overdo it, then we shouldn't worry so much about the money side. All right, now I'm going to dig into the first myth a bit further, but this is one I didn't mention, and this is the word sustainability. How often have you heard this word abused horribly? So you go to the shops, you go online, you look at a product catalogue, and you've got eco this, or green that, or sustainable this. Well, it's marketing bollocks, basically, because the fact is it takes resources to make things, and sure, let's be more eco, let's be more green, but sustainability really means, if something is truly sustainable, that you can continue indefinitely. That's what sustainable really means. It means that you're not extracting a resource faster than it can be replaced. Now, I think I'm in probably fairly safe company to say that what we're doing now, is it sustainable? I don't think so. In fact, I know it's not. It's absolutely not sustainable what we are doing right now. Right, so let's take that to its logical conclusion. And we've been running an unsustainable civilization since the mid-last century. There's a thing called the Great Acceleration. I'll go into that in a moment. What's the consequence of that? A thing that cannot go on? It means it's going to end. And our civilization is on the path to collapse. That's what that means. And people like me, people that I deal with, really reluctant to say that, put it quite so bluntly. But I have to say, and I really hate to say it, but that's where our business as usual, unless we radically change course, is headed for disaster. And that, in fact, is why Mark and I wrote this book, and it's called The Path to a Sustainable Civilization. What we're doing is we're bringing together all the different threads, and you could say it's quite a radical book. Well, Yes, it probably is in some views, but a fundamental problem requires a fundamental solution. How much time have we got? Not much, because we spent the last 40, 50 years saying we've got 10 years to fix this problem. And now look at where we are. All right, so let's go into these myths a bit more. Now, growth. How often do you hear someone from a government or somewhere saying that we've got to pump GDP, that we need a bigger economy because it's going to lift everybody out of poverty and so on? Well, take this for an example. You get 1 gram of yeast, you get a jar of warm sugary water, and you drop the yeast in, and that yeast will double its mass in about 90 minutes, okay? And after 90 minutes, after double that, it's double again and double and double and double. And I do this calculation multiple times because it did seem quite plausible, but it's real. After around about 3 weeks, if nothing else happens, the mass of that yeast will exceed the mass of the entire planet Earth. That's exponential growth. Now, clearly that cannot happen, and it does not happen, but this is the way we talk about our economy. And going along with that is population. Nobody wants to talk about population because it's seen as being racist. I really hate the idea that population growth, it gets conflated with racism. And it's so easy, and there are nasty people out there in the public world who make mileage out of doing that. And I don't buy into that, and Mark and I are very strong. We don't want racism. And yet it's ignored. And now look what's happening in Australia right now. In the current year, immigration numbers are over 400. I think it might be as high as 450,000 in 1 year. Now you think of the impact of that. It's going to be, well, in effect, we've got to build the city of Canberra, because Canberra's about, the population is about 400,000, right? So you think of what the infrastructure for that means. Think of how much water resources, how much land we're going to use. We're worried about koalas going extinct. Well, the cities are bursting their banks. It was very depressing in South Australia. We went to the edge of the city and you could see the city just growing. And guess what? It's growing across productive farming land. It's because cities are built in places that have good agriculture. And you look at the western suburb of Sydney, Melbourne is just sprayed right across, out towards Geelong and beyond to Werribee. And that's not sustainable. We're worried about the extinction crisis, water shortage and so on and so on. This is all multiplied. I call population growth the grand multiplier. Now, one of the big problems in talking about population is the disparity between wealthy people and poor people. Now, that is real. That is definitely real. And that is also unsustainable for multiple reasons. I mean, just take the simple equity. So the Earth is passing the, what do you call the overshoot day around about the 1st of August. So after the 1st of August, we are now in debt. We've been running up that debt for decades now, and that the planet will demand that debt back from us, and it'll do so in its own terms, not on our terms, and it'll be brutal. The overshoot day for a wealthy nation like Australia is around about the 1st of March. So our resource consumption is way up here. People down in poor countries, or they call it the global south, which I think is silly because we're a full in the south, aren't we? There's a simple equity thing. And think also whether that's socially sustainable. So if the environment in those places get trashed, so look at what's happening now, climate change, as sea level rises, we've got the delta in Bangladesh. If you want to see environmental refugees, you think we've got a boat people problem, as we used to call it, we haven't seen anything yet. And look what's happening in Europe. And I believe there's a good case that the wars in the Middle East around Syria and so on, the civil war and the exodus of refugees is largely driven by an environmental crisis, but it doesn't get mentioned, you see. Instead, it's put in terms of one religious group or another, religious tensions. Well, yes, okay, they're a factor, and I'm not expert, but the environmental impact on population is pretty much ignored. Now, there's this thing called the planetary boundaries. I think some of you might know that. Robbie, you're familiar with the planetary boundaries, I'm sure. Yes, but for those of you who haven't come across them, they are basically the health indicators for the state of the planet. And so if we take an analogy, the human body, so the safe operating limits for my body temperature, my blood sugars, the salts, calcium, and so on, my heart rate, they're all signs of a healthy human. Now, so there are 8 planetary boundaries, and they are things like climate change, fresh water, phosphorus, nitrogen, thing they call novel entities, and so on, right? We have exceeded the safe operating limits on 6 of those boundaries. 6. Well, that's 6, isn't it? That is not sustainable, and that means the Earth system as a whole is in trouble. And I mentioned we have entered the Anthropocene, that new geological epoch. We have had such a profound impact on the planet that we have probably averted the next ice age and maybe even the one after that. That's the impact of humans on this planet. So that's the physical, environmental side of the planet, but I've been talking about the social side of the planet as well. And Kate Raworth, an economist, I think she's British, yes, has a thing called the donut model. And she's bringing in social sustainability into the picture as well. And she's drawn this diagram. It looks like a donut, but I tend to think of it more as 2 lines like this. So at the bottom, if your society or country is not generating enough material wealth, then your people are not living in a socially sustainable way. So you've got an unhealthy population, right? But they're not causing pollution, environmental damage like we are. So we're at the top, so we're meeting social needs mostly, but we're not meeting environmental needs. So in between those 2 zones is a sweet spot. And I think I've seen analysis that no country is actually in that zone, or almost no countries are in that zone. Either their economy is too poor, their productivity is too poor, and the people are not doing well, or the productivity is way too high and generating too much waste and pollution and consuming too many resources. So what that means is that we, in the wealthy countries, we need to degrow. We need to bring down in a controlled way our consumption. And that's a really unpopular idea. And to be perfectly honest, I don't know how we're going to sell it. Because who's going to give up their 4-wheel drive and their trips to Europe? But the fact is that we have to do it. We have no choice, because if we don't do it ourselves, nature will do it for us. And it won't be pretty. All right, so the next myth is the technology myth, renewable energy and so on. So renewable energy is renewable from the point of view is it doesn't emit any pollutants while it's running, but it's not renewable from the point of view is that it actually uses up resources. So one wind turbine, how much copper you reckon? One single wind turbine, 4 tonnes. 4 tonnes of copper go into one wind turbine. Lithium, now energy storage is a crucial topic right now. Lithium is being mined in places like the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on the planet. And to extract that lithium, they need to leach They need to use water. So imagine what effect that's having on the environment. And so on and so on. You can look at terrible stories of mining around the planet. So the other thing about renewable energy is it can't keep up with growth. So around about 2000, 2001, all energy, of all energy uses, not just electricity, but industry, transport and so on, guess how much used fossil fuels? 80%, 80%, and 20% from renewable sources. Roll that story 20 years into the future and guess how much energy, total energy consumption is from fossil sources? 80%. It hasn't changed. And that's despite the prodigious growth in renewable energy. Why is that? It's because the economy is growing at the same time and it can't keep up. It's chasing a moving target the whole time. And of course, in the process, we're using non-renewable resources in order to do it. Carbon capture and storage is complete nonsense, and I don't even want to go there, but anytime you see carbon capture and storage, just put your big skeptometer on, because in my book it goes ping. And maybe it'll prove to be real, but not that I've seen so far. So the term they use for this is decoupling, that you can grow the economy and you can decouple the growth from the environmental impacts. Well, there is no evidence at all, really, or the evidence that that's possible is extremely poor. Now let's talk about the circular economy. So you say, okay, we're using these resources to build in electric vehicles and whatever. The thing is, the circular economy can only recover what's already in the economy. It can't cope with growth, right? So it's not going to help you there. But the other thing is that the circular economy leaks. It leaks like a sieve. And at every point through the life cycle of material, bits drop out and you can't get it back. So in the mining, in the production, the manufacture, the distribution, so like the truck is driving to the retail outlets, it crashes, bits go everywhere, and it ends up in a landfill. The consumer, like we're doing a pretty good job in Australia, Canberra, we're conscientious about putting stuff in the recycling bin, that's great. But bits will always get lost on the way through. And I've already given an example of an aluminium, which is one of the better because that's a homogeneous product. So we could do a huge amount better in our circular economy. We could get far more circular than we are right now, because we live in what I call the dud economy, D-U-D. We dig it up, we use it, sometimes for a very short period, and we dig another hole and we bury it. It's the linear economy. So Apple sued people on the internet for publishing instructions on how to repair a mobile phone. So is it a lost cause? No, it's not a lost cause. There's an enormous amount that we can do to improve the so-called circular economy. Forcing manufacturers to make products repairable, and so they glue the bits in the batteries and stuff. They make it incredibly difficult for you to actually get to anything in this phone, because the biggest competitor to this year's product is last year's product, and they want you to chuck it out and buy a new one. So that could be improved. Another one really affects all of us, and we are all complicit in the dud economy, because when I bought this mobile phone, I don't know, I bought a reasonably cheap one, $400, whatever it was, but I'm not paying the true cost of this phone, because I'm only paying for the minimum cost to acquire the phone. I'm not paying what economists call it an externality. So if I just chuck it in the bin, it becomes somebody else's problem, no longer my problem. I don't pay for that, but I think we really should be paying the life cycle cost of a product, because anyway, it's absolutely insane. Now, I brought another thing to show you, and Robert was looking a bit confused. Why would I bring this? It's a bit of rubbish. Yes, it really is a piece of rubbish. I picked it off the path this afternoon. Why did Rod bring a piece of rubbish into a talk? It's because it's an example. You ask the question, why was this thing lying on the ground? What caused it to be there? Well, the immediate cause is that somebody just chucked it there, right? Why did they just chuck it in the bin? Why didn't they chuck it in the bin? Maybe there wasn't a bin. But then maybe it was their attitude as well. Maybe they thought that it's okay to chuck something because it's not my problem. And so what we do in the book, Mark Diesendorf and I, is we dig below the surface issues. And that's why I've been talking about the myths, because so much of what you hear is about myths. It's about things that they're comforting stories, they're half-truths, or they're outright lies, which are designed to make us feel that we can just go on doing what we're already doing. Well, we can't go on doing what we're already doing, because as I've already said, it's going to lead to disaster. Now let's have a look at it. That's a trivial example, a bit of rubbish. Let's look at something, a bigger issue, climate change. Why are we experiencing climate change? Well, the obvious answer is greenhouse gases, right? Carbon dioxide, methane being the two biggies. Why do we have greenhouse gases? Because we're burning fossil fuels. We have agriculture and land clearing. But also we have an economy that is driving this stuff. Well, I've mentioned the externalities already. We have the growth economy. We have an economy that demands growth. And going with that, we've had population growth, which I've already talked about. And beneath all this is and I really hesitate to use this word, I'll explain why, but capitalism. Capitalism itself is a system that wants to exploit the environment, it wants to exploit people, and it wants to keep growing. Now that's a very negative way of putting it, and the reason I hesitate to use the word capitalism is because there could be multiple forms of capitalism. It doesn't have to be exploitative, at least I hope it doesn't. It doesn't mean to say that we can't have markets, because we need markets. It doesn't mean to say that we need to have the planned economy as the USSR tried to do, which was a complete disaster. They had a 5-year plan and agriculture failed and the economy was a complete mess because they tried to plan everything. So well, the other reason is I don't want to be seen as being a communist, right? Because that's the radical communist rabble-rouser, because I think there's a problem with capitalism. So I'm immediately going to make a whole bunch of enemies as soon as I say capitalism is the problem. So yeah, I've got to think really carefully, but so with those caveats, I think we've got to come out and say it. And then we've got to think about our values. What's really important to us? So this really sits underneath capitalism. Are our lives really, do we live just to be units of production? Are we here just so we can consume stuff? Or is there something more important? Like we have the Jung Society. Jung Society, a group of people who come together with a common interest, care about people, we care about how relationships, we care about, we want to look at the sky, admire the clouds, the trees and the grass, and the wonderful animals that Suzanne writes about in her book. the forms of life that are really essential. That's part of being alive. Do I get that from buying stuff? Not really. But capitalism, the form of capitalism I'm talking about, says if you're not spending money, then what are you doing? If you can't put a dollar value on it, then it's not worth anything. And we've got to seriously rethink that. All right, now, I'm winding to a close, but I don't want to leave you with a feeling of despair, because I've given you a pretty gloomy message. And so I got some more cheerful ideas, some more optimistic ideas from Erin Remblance, who has a fantastic online presence. And she was talking about some better stories. And there's a part of India called Kerala, Kerala, India. And they are doing some things that really should be a great example to all of us. The population is about 35 million. They score very highly on things like the Human Development Index and the Sustainable Development Index. And sorry, I can't give you details about how they work, but you can guess they're not GDP. GDP just measures the activity of the economy. That's all that does. And in fact, the guy, Kuznets, who invented it, said, do not use GDP as a measure of well-being, because it is not. Kerala in India has a high literacy rate, it has low corruption apparently, and low population growth. So there you go, it can be done. Another good example, Costa Rica. And myself and a friend, we interviewed the ambassador from Costa Rica a while ago, and they're a terrific example. They have a principle that they call universalism. And that idea, I mean, this is radical, isn't it? They say that healthcare, education, all the needs of the community are the prime functions of government. Not economic growth, the care for your people is what matters most. And you know what they did in 1948? 1948, get this, they abolished their military. They abolished their armed forces in 1948. And here in Australia, we're just tipping $300 billion into nuclear submarines. Sorry, we can't afford healthcare. We can't afford to look after our people, but we can afford $300 billion for nuclear submarines to make us a nuclear armed state. The country of Costa Rica has a really good GDP per person, and so the thing of population growth, right? You can say our GDP in gross terms is going up, but in Australia, our GDP per person is actually levelled out. So I'm not saying don't measure GDP, by the way. I'm just saying use it in the right way. And their population growth in 1960 was high 3%, nearly 4%. That's huge. In 2023, it was less than 1%. Less than 1%. Now, I had one other good story, and I'm sort of circling back, pun intended, to the circular economy, because I saw this story last week. A company in Scotland called RenewCell, and they take shredded cotton and denim, and they're recycling it, and they're turning into a new material called circulose. So the amount of clothing that gets wasted just chucked into landfill is appalling. So that's a great example of what can be done. Now, the last quote, Milton Friedman has this quote, and he says words to the effect that when a crisis occurs, the ideas that get used are the ones that happen to be lying around. So it's up to us, and it's not just people like me, but I think each of us here and everybody that you know, to generate those ideas, to spread them, and to be advocates for those ideas. Now, when I did my talk about the 10 journeys on a fragile planet, one thing I said in that was that not everybody's going to write books or do radio programs or whatever. You have to do a thing that works for your character. So do something that fits with your personality, with your life circumstance. So I'm going to wind it up, but the last thing I completely forgot to mention, so I'm going to chuck it in because I don't script my talks. This is, I talked about the economy and so on, and about why the government is steering the way it does, like the AUKUS agreement and so on, and that is a thing called state capture. And state capture is where the levers of government are co-opted by powerful vested interest money, influence, undue influence of people like us, ordinary people, people in the community. Our voices are being swamped, overridden by companies. Why are we opening more fossil fuel mines right now when the climate news is terrible? Why are we doing that? Because people in positions of power have undue influence. We have to do something about that, and we have to expose it, take the money out of the political system as much as we can. All right, so that's it for now, and I think we're going to come back for more discussion, and thank you.
Yep.
And some nibbles, I believe.
I think you deserve that. Yeah, thank you very much for your business of your talk. It's given us a lot to think about right now. Probably a bit too much.
Bit of brain overload, yes, I understand.
Anyway, very welcome to come and have supper with us and talk to Rob in a non-threatening sort of way.
All right, thank you.
To have you here, and we hopefully see you again. And you can take as many of those little booklets as you'd like to see, and then we'd love to hear from you.
Right, don't forget, Suzanne's got her book there. She's got one copy only if you'd like to buy one, and I do recommend it. Or, all right, so we've got time for a little bit of discussion and questions and stuff. And I just want to show you one thing before we launch into that. And I brought a couple of items out of the newspaper because I'm a dinosaur. I read the paper, the physical paper that is. And this one, I've been talking about with a few people. Damage in the Antarctic. Damage is done Antarctic dunes, right? So that's pretty. I couldn't even read this because I can't cope. I know this is happening, but that's really bad. Turn the page in the newspaper, and what have you got? Buy this, not picking on this vendor. Right, so did you see the conjunction of the two ideas? Right now, well, it's abstract, isn't it? It's an abstract idea. I can't see that. I've never been to the Antarctic, and the only way I know it is because I see it in the paper or whatever.
And it's just abstract, it's not really anything to do with you, so that's why. And when you go to shops, you get stuck, and you see it.
Yes, and that's like the story I was telling you about the Indigenous people. They were intimately connected with their environment, but am I connected to the Antarctic and so on? Can I see carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? No. So it's kind of a leap of imagination almost. Now, Janet had a question. Did you want to ask me?
Do you have a sense that people that matter in decision making particularly are having a sense that something imminent is changing? We really are facing...
The decision makers in particular?
Well, in general, but also particularly, I suppose, in
Yeah.
decision makers.
If the decision makers really appreciate it, if they really understood just how serious the situation is right now, surely their behaviour would be very different. But it's not, But I believe there are people in the federal government, in the governments, who really do know, but the political system is so untidy, it's so messy. So I was in an Australia Institute briefing a couple of days ago about the gas mining, and they were saying that there was a briefing paper or some publication by the government about why we need to sell gas. Well, we know that gas is extremely dangerous, the damage that it's doing. And according to the government, it's because we need to maintain relations with trading partners, so Japan, Korea, and so on. And really what that means is that selling gas is about buying economic and political influence. And the environmental stuff, well, you know, it's out there somewhere. It's in the Antarctic. And someone sent me an email today and they said, don't these people have children? Don't they have grandchildren? Don't they realise what they're doing? But you know this expression, maybe a Jungian perspective could say something about this, cognitive dissonance. And we all do it. Two completely incompatible ideas in the one skull, and they exist at the same time. In terms of the general public, I think that the lights are coming on, but what we need is a tipping point. We've already seen tipping points in climate, but I really hope that we get a tipping point in social activism and in the community. And the guy who led the anti-coal rally with Bob Brown et al. Up to Queensland, he said to me, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. Which is quite interesting. So something that Mark Diesendorf and I endorse is community action, grassroots stuff, Jung Society. I'm a member of Sustainable Population Australia, and I recommend them. There's a Citizens Climate Lobby. There's heaps of environment groups that look, you might not necessarily be a joiner of that sort, and I'm not really all that good with joining groups. But we need the people to move. Something that really worries me though is the response time, the lead time for sorts of things we're talking about. So the planetary system operates on a time scale this long, tens, hundreds of years long. The political cycle operates on a time scale this big. And how do you steer something that big with a brain that's only this big?
Well, there's no dimension to that, there's another dimension of that question of the paths to a sustainable civilization in terms of those timescales of different issues. And I was pleased to see you draw attention to that Antarctic article. And one of the issues there is that they say that absolutely nothing that we do in relation to carbon will make any difference to the melting of either Antarctica or Greenland. That as far as either emission reduction or greenhouse gas removal are concerned, no matter how much we try to accelerate the decarbonisation of the economy, that the West Antarctica ice sheet cannot be retained by that measure alone. But what I found interesting, and this was the theme that I discussed in the article that you published, that I wrote in the Canberra Times last year, Rod, that if we instead take a technological approach to brightening the planet and use technologies like marine cloud brightening, then it's absolutely possible to prevent Antarctica melting. And that brings in a new form of cognitive dissonance around this issue of how can we actually identify a path to a sustainable future. And it's something that does go back very much to Carl Jung, who was one of his popular titles is the father of the New Age. And so he was one of the things about New Age thinking. It's usually seen as a sort of Pollyanna-ish false optimism, and yet interestingly, Jung was very dark about his thoughts of the future. He felt in books that he wrote in the 1950s that the prospects for a sustainable civilization were very weak.
Can we just sort of go, you raised a question first and then we come back to it. I think you
Sure. Yeah, I'm just rambling. So I'm.
I've never done that myself.
But yeah, like if.
So your first question. Sorry, Suzanne has to go. And Janet. Well, thank you for coming. Yep. See you again. Okay, so I think your first question relates, as you said, that I ran a column that you wrote for in the Canberra Times and the Oz Community Media papers, and it comes under the umbrella of geoengineering. Can we force the climate using a technological solution back to a safe level? In other words, can we undo the damage of CO2 and methane emissions? My view is that's an act of desperation, and we're getting horribly close to a desperate point. The thing about meddling with the climate in that way is it's a vastly complicated system. We don't really understand how it works. We do at some level, and what we do to it, we're like we're nudging this big machine and hoping that it goes in a certain direction. So my professional background, apart from media, is in IT systems, and I can well remember many times I'd write a chunk of code and I didn't really know why it worked, or something, it was a bug in it, so I'd change it and then it would work, but I couldn't really understand why. And this is complex examples. Well, that's tiny compared to the complexity of the Earth system. So when we start poking the system, which we are already doing, obviously, now, we've got to be incredibly careful with that. If we are going to do it, it'd have to be something with a relatively short impact time frame. So injecting aerosols, I don't know how long the aerosols, you can answer this, how long are the aerosols active in the upper atmosphere to reflect the light, the heat back into space. But you get into all sorts of tricky things, so you could affect the rainfall pattern, for example. So you might send your aerosols up in the Atlantic or something, and maybe it'll affect the rainfall patterns in Africa. And who says you can do that? Are the African countries going to say you can do that? Is it the US or Britain or Australia? So it's really, really tricky. But maybe we're going to get desperate enough that we've got no choice.
Well, I think it's very clear that there is no choice. If you look at something like the melting of Antarctica example that you raised, it's clear that if we don't brighten the planet, then we will have a catastrophic loss of ice from West Antarctica and Greenland, and a series of cascading tipping elements. And so the risk framing is, the question is, we compare the experimental intervention in managing and regulating the global climate and weather versus just not doing it. And the main argument for not doing it is that will somehow create moral pressure to decarbonise the economy, but there's no evidence for that at all. And there's considerable evidence of path dependency, that the fossil fuel economy has just got such entrainment, such entrapment, that nothing we do about climate will actually cause people to use less fossil fuels.
Yeah. One thing that's not well recognised is just how our civilisation relies on energy. I mean, I'm sure you will understand, Robbie, but energy is everything, and you can't do... I wouldn't be speaking to you if I didn't have energy. There'd be no lights in this room, there would be no products in this room, and our civilisation has arisen on the back of cheap energy, really easily accessible energy, oil, coal primarily. But we've actually had an oil crisis before, and guess what? It was whale oil. We just about exterminated whales because lighting and heating and so on came off whale oil, and then discovered the mineral oil. Well, that mineral oil is now getting really, really hard to find.
Must have caused a problem in the corset industry. Whales declined.
So the problem that arises is that there's a growing movement of doomism, that is people who feel that there's absolutely nothing that can be done to prevent the collapse of civilization. And my view is that that's just wrong, because we can find a sequenced path which starts by brightening the planet. Like if we cooperate internationally to look at, and we can use some of these magnificent tools like artificial intelligence, machine learning, to work out how to do it in a way that actually works. And we can, there's quite a big scientific community working on this. Start off with very small interventions and gradually increase them.
I've got to confess that when I'm feeling a bit gloomy, and I think about this scale of the problem facing us now, and it's really hard to stay cheerful, and I know people who are depressed about our situation. Are we doomed? We're running pretty damn bloody close to the wind right now. I'll tell you one thing though, is since we're with the Jung Society, we talk about psychology. If there's one thing we could change about humans, said he, expressing a completely ridiculous wish, but anyway, here it is. Well, what would it be? If there's one facet of human nature or humans that you could change, what would you change?
Less children. Reduce the childbirth rate.
Ah, that's a good one. I would definitely endorse that. I'm talking about the way we think, and the one, yeah, definitely we've got to reduce the population growth. Our acceptance of lies, our acceptance of untruths, things that are not true, that would be the one thing, and it has become a political weapon, and we've got that appalling former US president now, who if he said that it was 12 o'clock, you'd have to check your watch, because you couldn't believe anything that man says. And so the truth has become weaponised, and and through social media and so on, it's amplified across the planet. And that is disaster, because if we can't accept the truth, we not only are we going to make terrible mistakes, but it erodes trust. So you look at the trust in institutions, the trust in expertise, the trust in science, the trust in each other has all been enormously damaged, because these straight lies are pervading our culture, and it's toxic, and it's a disaster. That's what I do. I can't see it happening tomorrow though, but maybe by the day after. Anyway.
That's right.
So
President Trump is sort of trading on, redoing all the lies, with the COVID.
yeah,
He was telling us all these
with the
false things, how to fix the COVID up,
yeah.
how it's easy, you can...
But there's something we can learn from him, and much as I detest him, he's a genius in this respect. He never talks about facts. Like we know that. So why is he so influential in the US? Apart from the fact I've already talked about a disaffected population, he talks emotion. He talks emotion. Everything he says is about its anger, resentment, and so on. Particularly those sort of very negative emotions. And that stuff is really powerful. And myself, I have a scientific inclination. My wife's a postdoc scientist. I hang around with science people and we value data. And if I say something that's wrong, I'm going to get shot. In fact, I can only walk, I've been shot so many times. And I do it to other people as well. And this critical thinking, it's really central to me. And look, not everybody's going to suddenly become scientists. But really, it points to the failure of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment in whatever, when was the Enlightenment? 17 something, the notion that if we had enough...
Yeah, around 250 years ago, around the time of the American
Oh,
independence.
yes, okay, yeah, yep. So the notion was that with enough rational thinking and data and everything, that we would all become really... Well, humans are not rational. Humans are not rational. We know that.
And that's one of the things that Carl Jung explored, like the power of symbols is one of his key themes, and recognising that mass culture runs off myths. And so exploring myth, you discussed the emotional comfort that people obtain from the half a dozen or so myths that you described. And that mass psychology has an incredible inertia. That's and so people come along and they, like I participate in debates around religion, and there are many atheists who say, look, atheism is simply rational, and so why do all of these myths about religion persist in the world? And it's got this emotional comforting dimension.
Humans are emotional creatures. We're also very tribal. So we tend to adopt the opinions of people around us, and even when they're blatantly wrong, is being part of the group is more important. That's one thing. But I'm glad you sort of pointed us in that direction, because one of the things that I would really like to see, which might be possible, unlike our attitude to truth, is a social tipping point. And that sort of goes to the question she had to go, Janet's question, is, and it has happened in history where there have been social tipping. Look what happened to the Berlin Wall. Just almost overnight, the Germany reunified, and no one really could predict it. And so I can only hope, if we are going to get ourselves a sustainable civilization, that we hit one of those tipping points. And then you can kind of see some signs of it, the rebellious groups and so on, the activist environment groups. But we've got to get rid of those people who are steering the government to just in self-interest.
So it raises the question of what aspects of the mythology in culture are actually positive. Are there elements of our cultural and religious mythologies that can be part of the solution? So, I did feel, Rod, that in giving your title, The Path to a Sustainable Civilization, you seem to essentially say that there is no path. Like you've highlighted so many of the problems, massive problems, that, I think of these in mythological terms of popular culture. It's like Star Wars. You look at Luke Skywalker trying to shoot down the Death Star, or you look at Frodo Baggins trying to deposit the Ring of Power in Mount Doom in Mordor. And the common theme in so much of that movie trope is that the task is completely impossible, and yet somehow miraculously it's achieved. And so we're at this sort of situation with our world, where you look at that newspaper article about Antarctica and you think, okay, well, so we're doomed. That article offers no hope at all. It just says, sea level's going to go up by 10 metres and there's nothing we can do about it. And yet the question is, how can we identify a path that can overcome that can lead us to a sustainable civilization.
Well, one thing that happened to me when I did a talk a while ago was, you know, the talk went really well and the people were really engaged, and I sort of wound up and I gave a bit of a rah, come on, let's go do it sort of thing. And this guy put his hand up and he said, oh, got a problem with that. And I thought, oh, crikey. And he said, I've been doing this since 1970 something and look at where we are now. And how do you answer something like that? And my wife's a bit the same. She's working in the environment movement. You know, she's got an ecology PhD and so on. But she was active and she said she's tired, she's worn out. Well, I can definitely understand that. But for me, it gives me reason to get up in the morning. I've got a purpose. So I used to be doing IT stuff and I get paid very nicely. I got sick of it because it wasn't very personally rewarding. Now I'm not getting paid, I'm being paid bugger all, but I'm doing something that's extremely rewarding. But also, nothing is worse than the feeling of powerlessness. If you feel powerless, that you've got no hope, there's nothing you can do, well, that's a self-fulfilling situation. That's a self-fulfilling frame of mind.
Well, it's a situation of despair without hope.
Yes, that's right. So and a very depressing place to be. No one wants to be there, but in the face of this situation, it's hard not to fall into that. But as I say, one way will probably fail. Doing nothing will definitely fail.
I think we need to learn from history. I think we need to learn from history, even our own Australian history. If we look at the early settlers that came here to this country, just looking at Australia, I mean, I've been reading Bruce Pascoe's updated Dark Emu and delving into Bill Gamage's book. Has anyone read that one, The Greatest State on Earth? And it's all about the Aborigines. And the white settlers actually came and they actually recorded in their journals that even in Central Australia, it was green. It was being looked after. There were verdant fields of people were walking around in clothes and fishing and, you know, having deals with the whales so they could only just take one, and they had a deal with the whales until somebody, white man came along and shot one, and then they stopped.
Have you read Robert Hughes' Fatal Shore?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, it's a fantastic story of the first colonial settlement in Australia. And the Australian colony came that close to failing because they brought all the supplies, everything with them.
Yeah, they did.
Was it 11 ships, I think, in the first fleet?
Plus smallpox.
Yeah, well, the resupply ships were delayed and the colony almost starved, and they had to institute really stringent, like, I think there were even a few people executed for stealing food and so.
They could have survived without any of that just by listening to the Aborigines and getting on with them.
That's exactly where I'm going, because all around them were these Aboriginal people.
Yeah.
And they were doing just fine.
Fine,
Thank you very much. But as Jared Diamond said in his fantastic book, Guns, Germs and Steel, they didn't have guns, germs and steel.
They didn't.
And so they were called primitive. To the Western eye, they looked primitive. Well, that completely ignores the incredible sophistication of those people.
Absolutely. The way they caught fish and everything.
In this landscape and not destroy it. And I think not only do we need to give some justice to the first people of Australia, we need to learn from them, because they did something we have not achieved.
No.
And we're a long way from achieving. So if we have people on Zoom.
Can I come back to population question?
Yeah.
Because to me, that's the ultimate solution. But the problem is the time span. Now,
Yes.
Population growth in China, into which there's virtually no immigration, has really levelled out because of the one-child policy, and the fact that the population hasn't liked the idea of going back to having big families like they used to a couple of generations ago. So there's a huge demographic problem there, and social problems and so forth, and which is rather interesting. But and in Australia we have a less than replacement natural
Yes.
where
I think
it's
it's,
only sustained.
it
as you
was
said,
one
by
point, it was
considerable
1.7 or something per couple or something, I think
Yeah,
is
it was
roughly.
1.6 or something.
1.6, okay, Yep.
Children per
family, yeah.
female, that's
Yeah.
right, of childbearing age, that's right. Considerably less than sustainable. And in many
Replacement,
other countries
let's
in
use the
world,
word replacement.
Replacement probably
Thank you.
is
Yeah,
the
keep
word,
going.
yes, that's right. And in many other countries, Eastern Europe, Russia and so forth.
Yeah.
In Brazil now, once contraception was widely available and people going no longer listening to the Pope so much, the saying is, oh well, when Grandma says, what about the lovely big family of grandchildren? And the daughter says, oh well, the factory's closed now. But
So-
in West Africa...
So
of
what's
course,
your question?
my question is, to me, there's hope in terms of reducing the population. Now, that may happen by dreadful, unhappy means, starvation and so forth, Malthusian type stuff, or hopefully it can happen by planned and strong measures like we've had in China and India, somewhat behind that. My question perhaps is, Dick Smith, we used to hear something of in regard to all this. What's he up to these days?
Oh, Dick Smith?
Yeah.
He's one of the patrons of, or used to be, of Sustainable Population Australia.
Yes.
I haven't heard from Dick Smith for a while, but that's a fairly specific question. But did you?
My question perhaps is, what do you think is the value or the prospect of progress via population reduction, or at least quickly stopping the growth and moving towards reduction?
Yes. Look, in Australia, we could do it today, couldn't we? We would just pull immigration right back, and instead of the absolutely insane level we have right now. But something we should really be doing is, like, we keep hacking back our foreign aid budgets. And before I was talking about the modern monetary theory about this money supply not being nearly an issue that it's supposed to be. We could be helping foreign countries and giving women the power to control their own productivity. And that's, if we're doing something for foreign aid, now that's a slightly touchy thing for me to say, because it could sound like me saying, oh, you poor people in your country, you should breed less. So I'm slightly nervous about saying that, but it's got to be under their own control. But also you mentioned, I think, momentum or something, that is, in some cultures, the big family is a sign of success and the children look after me. So that's not easy to change. And I don't want me as a well-to-do middle-class white Australian going into some other country saying you've got to breed less. But the evidence seems to show that if you give women control over their own productivity, then they will just do it anyway. So the population growth in Papua New Guinea apparently is just completely out of control. Do you know that? In Nigeria, it's insane, like 3.7 or whatever. But there are some countries where population is levelled out and even slowly declining. Japan, but it's not destroying their economy. And the idea that we've got to have a big population, like, real men have rippling chests and talk about a big Australia. Actually, and Julia Gillard, I have to say, talked about a big Australia.
Kevin Rudd is a proponent of that, unfortunately.
Yeah. So it's a really sloppy way to try and grow the economy, like lack of imagination. So the best you can come with is by, pumping up the numbers.
Well,
Really?
I'll tell you what, if we don't do something about the murdering of women by partners, of male partners and husbands, we mightn't have much of a population as we are after all, because women will just...
You know, domestic violence.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, domestic violence is out of control.
Yeah.
I think it's a big problem.
You know,
Not just here in Australia.
I long for the day when a government doesn't proclaim their success because of the growth in GDP, but because of what they do for vulnerable people.
Exactly, you know, we're not grown up, are we? We're still children. The country, the society, we're still, you know, in the play school. We haven't grown up and taken responsibility for our lives.
Because bringing people in without housing and without the educational facilities is a big issue.
Well,
You know, like the kids that can't speak English in the classroom.
you seeing that?
Yeah, we've got kids in our classroom can't speak English because
Well-
they're not getting enough help, assistance.
So they go home to their parents.
He-
Yeah, and ESL's.
Here's a couple of headlines that I didn't read out to you. This one says, infrastructure work an all-time high. Because to cope with ever-increasing numbers, the schools, hospitals, police services, roads, they can't spend it quickly enough to keep up with all of this stuff. And so the service to all of us is declining. Sorry, did you hear a comment?
Population boost comes from 400,000 adults rather than 400,000 babies to bring it to a population growth of zero, rather than a negative population growth.
They're bringing the population in too fast, aren't they? You know, they should be being a bit slower to allow the housing and the education aspect to, you know, put more infrastructure in to deal with these situations. Particularly in the schools, they've taken a lot of infrastructure out, like specialist teachers, specialist people to work with these kids. You know, the school teacher, has to laugh a bit, was called in to work in a classroom. But they can't get enough teachers to be in a classroom.
Hmm.
And she's supposed to be working with these kids from overseas. Where's that?
And there's not enough teachers to look after disabled children. Look at that child that was killed in the lift the other day.
Yes.
St Lucy's School in Warruga. I mean, that school has very, very seriously disabled children. It requires a lot of staff. That's a lot of economic.
And we're really struggling to supply teachers for schools. And if all the professions that we should praise, everybody should love teachers.
Absolutely, I'll take my hat off.
And
to them. I don't know how Jean's offered.
here's another headline. Capital's property market on the rise. What a cheerful rah, 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 you know, housing boom. But you know what this does? We don't have a housing shortage problem. We have a people excess problem. And so the number of houses we have to build, supply and demand simply says that the prices are going to go up, rent's going to go up, it's going to get hard to get someone to stay. And who are the worst affected by that? The people who can't afford it. That's the poor people at the bottom of the economic group. And so you want to get a growing proportion of disadvantaged people in our society. You put up the price of housing, and that's what we're doing.
And they've probably become like America, big suburbs of America, all in little dwellings and things on the side of the road.
There's things called gated communities, because
Little boxes, isn't there a 60s
you get
song on that one? Little boxes made of ticky-tacky.
They become like that, like all these little tiny little abodes and
well, what happens in a society is, I mean, you're always going to get inequality. That's just normal, and that's fine up to a certain point. But when you start getting this big split, you get this sort of the privileged people floating to the top, and then they sort of form an island universe, and they detach, and they lose connection, right? And what happens then is that people down in the bottom get angry and resentful, and you get riots like I described in Brixton. And then the people in the elite, who now they're disconnected from these people down here, they start to fear them. And then you get towards autocracy, because they've got to suppress those people. And one of the things, really interesting study I did in my university days was why systems collapse. And there's something really common across the systems we studied, the Mount Erebus Air New Zealand plane. I crashed into the glacier and was on a tourist flight. And the Westgate Bridge, it collapsed over the Yarra. And the Challenger disaster. In every case, the further up the management stream you went, the rosier things became. So in the Challenger disaster, the engineers on the ground floor, they knew there was a whole bunch of problems with the Challenger, right? And their estimated time between catastrophic failure of the spaceship was something like 1 in 100. And as you went up through the layers of management, it became 1 in 100, 1 in several hundred. And then when you got to the official NASA view, it was 1 in several thousand.
Yeah.
And this is the disconnect that we're seeing, because we were asking about people in power. When are they going to realise? Well, are they living in an island universe?
Yeah, it's this insulation problem, and we see it with climate change in that, like the Paris Accord suggests that it's possible to use emission reduction in order to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there's a big disconnect between
No, we
scientists
can
are
unplug it,
saying
but not turn
and
it off, because
what
I'm listening to
the
the,
government people are saying.
Yeah.
And so you've got this filtering process that you've
and I guess we
described,
can unplug
which is
that
just
too,
each
not
successive
turn it off.
layer of
But we want to know,
decision-making
yeah.
and authority just presents filters out the information and essentially censors the information so that the people in power can't hear
Throw that out.
the truth.
And you know what, they use political thinking to deal with a scientific problem.
We'll put that
And so they say, look, I can't do, let's take a negotiation. I can't do 1.5 degrees, but I can do 2. Well, we're already seeing that 1.5 is not safe. But they're applying the wrong model of thinking, the wrong system of logic to a problem where it doesn't fit.
Well, you can't negotiate with the planet.
You can't exactly. And the planet doesn't care about what party you vote for.
But Rod, I wanted to come back to Carl Jung and what he has to say about a path to a sustainable civilization. And I think one of the really valuable things in Jung is taking a longer view of human culture and expressing respect for cultural traditions while still appraising those traditions from a scientific perspective. And so it's a big problem in religion that there's so much in religion that's just so totally unscientific and anti-scientific, in fact. And yet Jung says, well, what's the real meaning of all of this symbolic language that we have, for example, in Christianity? And can we find something that accords with our modern scientific understanding of the universe that still takes value out of it, like rather than taking the line of Freud, which was just junk the past because it's obsolete. Jung said, let's build upon the past and but reinterpret it.
Yeah.
That's what I said, just exactly that. Meaning we need to build on what went before in order to create a better future, like more positive future.
But it's a lot more complex than just saying, like in the example of Australia, asking, like how can we, for example, respect Indigenous traditions and values and culture while living in a modern world. Now that's a really complex one, but I suppose I was looking at it on a more sort of global frame of how can we respect the what's good within Christianity while at the same time being critical of the for example, literal fundamentalism.
Yeah.
Well, I think we do need to treat people with respect, because if you want to make an enemy, you don't treat them with respect. But there are aspects of religion that have to change, and because we have got no choice. So the idea that man, and I use the word deliberately, was given dominion over the earth, and we to do with as we wish, because it's our plaything. But when we are destroying that thing, that's not a viable attitude. So, and I talked earlier about values. We have to value the planet that we live on and the natural environments, the trees, the plants, and everything. They are part of us, and when we destroy them, we destroy ourselves. So, yes, we've got to treat people with respect, but.
So, Rod, that's a great example of a religious story that, rather than just junking the concept of dominion, it's something that can be reinterpreted as meaning stewardship, as meaning care, as meaning love, and also as meaning that, like the Bible says, we're made in the image of God, and that's, people take that in a very literal way. But then if we say our species does actually physically have dominion over our planet, like it's up to us to decide what the future of our planetary environment is.
Yes, and I understand there are religious movements where people are reinterpreting dominion, just like you say, that this planet is a gift to us, if you want to see it that way, and then it's up to us to look after it and care for it, because as Aboriginal people say, if you care for the land will care for you. But yeah, we've got to shift it by the idea that we dominate, we manage the land because it's ours to exploit until it's gone. That's obviously not tenable.
So, like, domination is a different concept from dominion, but it's been interpreted as the same in our colonial traditions.
I think we've passed the 10 o'clock mark.
Thank you very much. It's just been marvellous.
Thank you, Jean.
And there's some little thing.
Oh,
Yeah, it's just a tiny thing.
oh,
Something to take away and put to feast your eyes on. It's just a certificate in there. A thank you letter.
all right.
A certificate to say thank you,
Good.
appreciation.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you all those who've survived this long.
Fallen asleep anyway, that's something, isn't it?
Yeah, I get a day's respite, and then I've got to.
Working again.
Then
Anyway, keep in touch with us. We'd love to have you maybe next year again. See how you're going.
I haven't worn out my welcome yet. I've got to keep.
Oh no, we won't.
I've got to keep working on it.
Because we've got so much that's happening in the history now. Right before our eyes, isn't it? History is taking a hold in the different wars that are happening in Middle East and Europe and that. So it's happening right there. Climate change.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank you for your efforts coming along, and your book. We'll be interested to read it, and I'll let you know how we go with it.
I'll be asking you lots of questions.
Yes.
Make sure. So, thank you. Thank you.
Also, I'd like to say there's a Christmas party coming up, so you're very welcome to come along. Bring your lovely wife.